Hello everyone, I'm Foldpapers, and this is the panel that wasn't, which is what I've taken to calling this presentation, because it was originally meant to be done at this past BroNYCon in early January. Unfortunately, in what was one of my more embarrassing moments in recent memory, I ran into some technical issues that prevented me from giving it at the con, so as promised I'm now putting it online instead. It took me a while to find time to sit down and record it. The good news is I've put back in a few parts I'd initially had to cut for time, but this is essentially what you would have seen at the con. Sorry for the delay. I hope it'll prove worth the wait. So as you've no doubt gathered from this first slide, I'll be talking about some of the classical and mythological elements of My Little Pony, Friendship is Magic. It's not a phrase I'd ever imagined myself saying, but as we'll see, it is actually possible to say it and be serious. Now, since this topic isn't necessarily to everyone's interest, I'd originally planned on offering the audience a deal. Give me half an hour or so of your time, it's about an hour now actually, and if I haven't managed to earn your attention by the end, you get to throw stuff at me. Whatever you happen to have handy, which I think is more than fair. But obviously, since this is now a recording, that option is no longer really on the table, since you can, switch me off if you get bored. But if you're really feeling put out for some reason, you can feel free to throw things at me if you happen to see me at a con. Really, I would prefer you didn't, but I leave that to your personal sense of morality. Also, I will have my contact details at the end if you have any questions or comments or corrections. Since as a disclaimer, I'm really not an expert here. I'm just an enthusiast. Anyway, let's get to it. We begin by asking the very fair and obvious question, why? Why talk about this? What's the larger purpose and significance? And the initial answer is actually quite simple. Because we can. And I'm not just being flippant here, because that's really not the best reason to do anything. What I mean is this. It's worthwhile to have this discussion, because the show is in fact sufficiently nuanced that it can actually support this kind of analysis. That's another way of saying because we can. But this isn't something you generally expect from a show with this pedigree, this name behind it. As we all know, the MLP franchise was initially developed to sell toys, and although Friendship is Magic is meant to be more educational and didactic on a certain level, you still don't necessarily expect to find true depth. There are plenty of kids' TV shows with a moral message that have no real substance to them aside from that message, and as a result, they end up delivering it quite poorly. So it's a real curiosity, a real break from type, to find that kind of depth here in MLP. And it's worth exploring, not just for the fact that it's there, but also in order to discern the broader implications of it being there, which there are, and which I hope will become clearer as we go on. Now that depth is something a lot of us already appreciate, whether we know it or not. Because when we're asked about what we find appealing in the show, why we of all people watch it, more often than not we'll say something about the quality of the art, or the excellent voice acting, or any number of other factors that work in the show's favour. But more often than not, we'll also praise the writing. We'll say the writing is good. Well, what do we mean by this? What do we mean when we say the writing is good? Well, we mean it has good characterization, that each of the characters is three-dimensional and fully realized, that they have realistic motivations and flaws, they even show signs of growth between episodes in some cases, that overall they and their relationships with the other characters are believable, which is not easy to pull off in a show about magical candy-coloured ponies, I grant you. We talk about the humour, the wordplay and the puns, the silly situations the writers come up with, and just the general sense of fun that the show has in droves. We talk about the dialogue, how, thank goodness, it's not overly cutesy or wootsy or cloyingly saccharine as it could be, because none of us would want to sit through that. Certainly I wouldn't. And of course, we talk about the... You know what? No. And of course, we talk about the storyline, how the episodes are well structured and balanced and present interesting situations that neatly avoid being too formulaic and occasionally even defy our genre-savvy expectations as viewers. But what we also talk about, and what helps make the writing so good, in my view, are the allusions, the references the show makes, either directly or indirectly, to other works of fiction or popular culture. Adherents of post-structuralism might call this intertextuality. Some of these are fairly obvious call-outs, like, for example, the end sequence of The Return of Harmony, Part 2, which is very consciously and indirectly riffed on the scene, the throne room sequence from Star Wars, as you can see here. This is from a great comparison video on YouTube that breaks it down shot by shot. More recently, we had a scene set in a factory that echoed a famous moment from I Love Lucy. These are examples more of the visual allusions the show makes, and allusions to more modern works. The kind of connections I want to discuss are those that exist, or surprisingly, and equally interestingly, in some cases don't exist where you might expect them to, the connections that exist between the show and the classical world and its associated mythology, connections that are inherently rooted in actual texts. You see these connections, or the lack of them, most clearly in the construction of the characters, and also in the situations that directly drive the storyline. So let's take a look at the characters first and talk about the main six. Yay, ponies! And there they all are. We have our Earth ponies, we have our unicorns, and of course we have our Pegasi. Let's begin with the Earth ponies. Yay, good old Applejack. Woo! And of course Pinkie Pie. Now, you would think that Earth ponies, being the closest of the three types to real ponies or horses, lacking as they do horns and wings and the obvious use of magic, you would think they would be fairly common in classical mythology, but surprisingly they get very little real mention. There are a few exceptions, most notable of which are the mares that belong to the Greek hero Diomedes, which were very creatively known as the mares of Diomedes. Tradition holds that these were the progenitors, the ancestors of Alexander the Great's horse, Bucephalus, who also gets some attention in his own right, but not very much. And there are the mares of Diomedes, being captured by Heracles, or Hercules, as his 8th labour. Unfortunately for our purposes, despite being fairly well documented, the mares of Diomedes were in fact man-eating horses. So I don't quite think we can draw a clear comparison between them and Pinkie Pie and Applejack. At least I really hope not. And for the love of God, no one turn that into a fanfic, I implore you. The fact is, in classical mythology, you're more likely to encounter creatures that are part horse and part something else, like, for example, centaurs. You even get a passing reference to centaurs in the Iliad. Earth ponies just get short shrift in the pantheon. If you want to see more of them in mythology, you're much better off looking at Norse and Welsh and Celtic traditions, where they're much more prevalent. Sadly, in non-mythological classical sources, you also don't see much about them, although there is a rather fun exception with the Roman Emperor Caligula. Yeah, we're going to be covering all sorts of ground in this. He looks like such a nice guy, doesn't he? Or not. It is said, by some, that either because he was crazy, or because he wanted to basically give the Roman Senate a giant middle finger, Caligula named his favourite horse as consul, the highest government position. Now, by this point in Roman history, all true political and military power lay with the emperor, with Caligula in this case, but the various elected positions, including the 2 consul seats, were still regularly voted on so as to maintain at least the appearance of a republic. So having a horse appointed to what was supposedly the most senior elected position in Rome was just a little bit of a scandal. The historian Suetonius also writes that this horse, which was named Incitatus, enjoyed ridiculously overblown luxuries like a stable made entirely of marble, and even more absurdly, purple blankets. Now this is a big deal. In antiquity, purple was a colour reserved really only for the highest ranking individuals. Senators, for example, wore togas with a purple stripe as a sign of their rank, and victorious generals who were celebrating a triumphal parade through Rome after their victories were permitted to wear a fully purple toga outfit. Purple was reserved for the hoity-toity. See what I did there? Because it was very expensive given the rarity, see what I did there, of the necessary dyes. Just some fun facts there. Good for parties. Anyway, enough tangents for now. The long and short of it is this: if we are looking for classical or mythological counterparts to some of our favourite types of ponies, we're clearly going to have to look at the other two kinds. And so we move on to our favourite unicorns. Rarity, and of course to Twilight Sparkle. She looks so very happy reading, I approve of that. Now again, you would think, given the widespread appearance of unicorns in modern popular culture and mythology and fairy tales and viral videos about Candy Mountain, Charlie, you would think that this would be a no-brainer, that unicorns would be everywhere in the classical world as well. And to be fair, you do find some scattered images of horned magical horses in other mythological traditions. But so far as the Romans and the Greeks were concerned, unicorns weren't particularly mystical. They were, in fact, unfortunately, this. Very unfortunately for Rarity and Twilight, these are essentially our classical unicorns, at least so far as the natural history writers of the time were concerned. Now, certainly they were exotic and shrouded in mystery, living as far from Rome as they did, but they were still generally understood to be quite real. And I really don't imagine Rarity or Twilight would be particularly thrilled to discover that they have rhinos as their mythological ancestors. I picture it a little bit like this: Twilight's reaction, and Rarity's reaction. Yeah, poor Rarity. So let's move on to what everyone knew was coming: PEGASI. If Earth ponies and unicorns are distinctive in classical mythology by virtue of their virtual absence, PEGASI are the exact opposite. And here's Fluttershy looking adorable, as always. And here's Rainbow Dash looking like Rainbow Dash. Nothing more needs to be said there. The image speaks for itself. I wish I could leave that up there a little bit longer. Now, you find several winged horses in classical mythology, but the truest source of our familiar PEGASI was a single winged horse named Pegasus. Over time, the word has come to refer to any winged horse, but in context, Pegasus was, as Dash would put it, the one and only. I shouldn't do that. And he himself recurs in various myths. He was said to be the offspring of Poseidon, the god of the sea, and the Gorgon Medusa, hideous monster. When the hero Perseus defeated Medusa and lopped off her head, Pegasus sprang forth from the decapitated body, which is pretty damn cool. Not very pony, but undeniably pretty damn cool. So this is an image of Pegasus after being captured by another hero, Bellerophon, who subsequently used him to help defeat the Chimera, another monster. Classical mythology and mythology in general, you have to understand, is nothing if not replete with heroes running around killing monsters. That is actually kind of the point. Anyway, unfortunately for Bellerophon, after his victory over the Chimera, he got a little bit too cocky, and decided in his hubris to fly Pegasus up to Mount Olympus and mingle with the gods. This was a mistake. You don't do this. And as you might imagine, Zeus was less than pleased, and so he sent a gadfly to sting Pegasus. Pegasus was stung, and as a result, bucked Bellerophon off. And I had to be very careful saying that, and I almost missed it. Bellerophon fell back to Earth. He survived, but that put rather an abrupt end to his adventuring days. I have to say it. I'm sorry. In other words, Bellerophon used to be an adventurer, and then he took a gadfly to the horse. I know that was bad. I'm sorry. It was crap. I had to take it. It was there. You would have to. Far more importantly for our purposes, Pegasus made it all the way to Mount Olympus, and in fact became the carrier of Zeus's lightning bolts. So we can take away something very important from this. The connection between Pegasi and the weather isn't new. It in fact goes all the way back to the source mythology. Now, I'm reliably informed, and I really hope this is right, and I'm sure I'll be corrected if I'm wrong, I'm reliably informed that in earlier iterations of the My Little Pony franchise, these sorts of connections with the Greek origins of the Pegasi weren't really played up or emphasized. Now, whether that's the case or not, this is very much not so in Friendship is Magic. You see the Grecian influence stemming from the Pegasus myth absolutely everywhere. Next slide. Take, for example, the architecture of Cloudsdale. Nothing gets more classical than columns. They're bloody everywhere. And actually, if you can tell me what kind of columns these are, used throughout Cloudsdale, I will be very impressed, and I will be grateful because I don't know, and I figured this presentation was long enough without lingering on bloody columns. There's also the armour worn by Princess Celestia's guards throughout the series. I think the Greek influence there is pretty clear. And of course, the first time we see them, they're pulling a chariot, of all things. And very recently, there's the clothing, shown here, worn by the Pegasi, and the armour, also shown here, worn in character by Rainbow Dash and her guards in the flashback sequence in the episode Hearthwarming Eve. What's interesting here is that you're seeing founding myth within the already mythologically influenced setting of the world of the show. And also seeing that, just as with us, the ponies' ancient past still resonates in their present, like, again, in the armour worn by Celestia's guards in their present, which calls back to the armour of the original Pegasi settlers when Equestria was founded. Everyone still with me? Cool. You see those Greek touches throughout the show. In other words, the writers positioned the Pegasi very much in line with their mythological origins and the original character from which their name is derived. And that extended so far as to influence the artistic choices made in how the Pegasi are visually depicted, and also in how they act. We see them in Hearthwarming Eve as initially very militant and imperialistic, which fits very nicely with the prevailing attitudes of ancient Greece, and especially of ancient Rome. Now, we're going to get back to why these choices for the characters are significant, but for now, let's move on from talking about the mythological influences in the characters, or the lack thereof, to talking about the influences in specific scenes from the show. Part 2, Scenes. And there are many plot points. Oh, damn it. There are many plot points, I'm just going to say it, you know what? And sequences in the show that are directly influenced by this mythology from which to choose. I'm going to talk about 3 in particular. Now, these 3, or at least the general gist of them, are likely familiar to everyone. They stand out, which is why I chose them, part of why I chose them. But I'll recap each one in turn, because it's fun, for me, hopefully for you, and because that way you can get a better view of precisely how they relate to the show. We're going to start off with the story of Androcles and the lion. In the earliest recorded version of the story, Androcles was a slave in Roman-controlled Africa. He escaped his masters and took shelter in a cave, which he subsequently discovered was the den of a particularly large and ferocious lion. Slight mistake there. However, as it turned out, the lion was wounded. It had, everyone say it with me, no seriously, say it with me, it had a thorn in its paw. Now, Androcles was a tender-hearted, animal-loving sort of person. Is this sounding familiar yet? Cool. And so he very carefully and gently removed the thorn and bandaged the wound and nursed the lion back to health, as you do if you have some sort of bizarre death wish involving being ripped to shreds by a lion. But lo and behold, under his influence, the lion became tame and almost like his pet. Fluttershy would approve. Time goes by, and Androcles starts missing civilization because clearly he had it so good as a slave. So he returned to Rome. Again, just a slight mistake there. Fugitive slaves, just in our time, or a little bit prior to our time, fugitive slaves were not well treated in the ancient world. He could have been branded on the forehead, if he was lucky. He could have been whipped to death. He could have been crucified. But in Androcles' case, he was just sentenced to be devoured by wild animals in the Circus Maximus in Rome for the amusement of the gathered crowds. In other words, he got off fairly lightly. And as another tangent, just more fun party facts, here in this model you see the Circus Maximus in the foreground and the Colosseum in the background. The Circus Maximus was actually built long before the Colosseum, but everyone still talks about the Colosseum instead. It's not bloody fair. But getting back to the story, and since this is a profoundly boring slide, unless you happen to like models, we're going to go with something slightly more exciting. Excellent. Are you not entertained? Well, I mean, it's close enough. Anyway. Androcles, Russell Crowe. I'd swear up and down there's a resemblance. Just pretend he hasn't got a sword. Use your imagination. And playing the part of the lion will be it the tiger. It is the right genus, so again, close enough. So Androcles was there in the Circus Maximus, not wielding a sword and shield, and not fighting off Tigris of Gaul, but instead watching in horror as all around him his fellow condemned prisoners were being devoured by countless nasty, fierce animals with nasty, bloody great big huge teeth, and eventually he was the only one left alive. And the crowd was getting restless, the animals were closing in from all sides, and the sands were stained with blood, and the English major was trying to be poetic. But then the largest and most fearsome of all these animals approached the terrified Androcles and licked his hand. And wouldn't you know it, it was the very same lion from the cave. It too had been captured and sentenced to die in the arena. And the nuzzle lioned Androcles affectionately and lashed out at all the other animals whenever they got too close. He was protecting his friend. And the crowd was amazed at the spectacle they were witnessing, this living testament to the power of kindness to turn enemies into unlikely friends. The Romans weren't big on kindness in this sort of situation, or really in general, so this was clearly something rather special. Of course, it is just a story, but it's a nice one, because in this story, wouldn't you know it, the Emperor himself, in some versions, even it's our favourite pony-obsessed oddball, Caligula, perhaps the original Brony. He was there in the audience, and he was equally moved by what he saw. And so he goes on to not only pardon and free both Androcles and the lion, but also to bestow the lion on Androcles as a gift, as a pet, so that they could remain together. My phone going off? Stop it. And they live happily ever after. Man and lion. It's a sweet story. It's nice. So now we have the basis for this scene in part 2 of the pilot episode, where Fluttershy, showing kindness to this seeming enemy and the unlikeliest of friends, pulls a thorn from a ferocious manticore's paw. Crucially, though, we obviously have several modern twists, because rather than a man and a beast playing the drama out, we have 2 mythological creatures, a Pegasus, and a female one at that, standing in for Russell Crowe, and a manticore, a part lion creature, in place of the lion, or the tiger. Again, these are mythological references encapsulated within mythological references. It's practically Inception with a cutie mark. But what does it mean? Well, we're getting to that. Trust me, we are getting to that. But first, we jump forward a whole season to the second of the 3 scenes, one which references another story with which everyone's probably vaguely familiar. And that is the Labyrinth, and the Labyrinth sequence in The Return of Harmony, Part 1, the opener to Season 2. I am assuming most of my audience are familiar with that. Now, for a lot of people, when you think of a labyrinth, or the labyrinth, the first image that comes to mind is this. Hopefully, anyway. I really hope I'm not alone in that. I really hope you were all thinking it too. But in fact, what I mean by the labyrinth is very much the labyrinth, capital T, capital L, the original, the first, the definite, definitive article. And here it is, on the left, a medieval take on the Cretan labyrinth. Not the Cretan labyrinth, although you'd have to be pretty stupid to go in there, but the labyrinth on the Greek island of Crete. And on our right is the labyrinth of our show. And the story of the labyrinth, of course, has at its let's try that one again. And the story of the labyrinth, of course, has at its heart, as the vast majority do, a hero with a monster to kill. In this case, the monster is the Minotaur, another mixed creature, one with the body of a man and the head of a bull. The labyrinth was constructed on the orders of King Minos, or Minos, however you want to say it, the ruler of Crete, specifically to hold the Minotaur, because the Minotaur was the offspring of his wife, Pasiphae. I am butchering the names, but bear with me. Now, believe it or not, his wife, as far as we understand it in modernity, was not generally in the habit of sleeping with any animal that came along. The dirty deed came about because, like so many other kings, Minos managed to offend the gods, and specifically one god in particular. He was in competition with his brothers over who would rule Crete, and one day he prayed to the god Poseidon to send him a snow-white bull as a show of support to establish his divine right to rulership, if you will. And the plan was then to sacrifice the bull back to Poseidon in Poseidon's honour. Well, Poseidon was kind that day and sent the bull, but Minos decided to keep it for himself and instead sacrificed a different bull in its place. Why exactly he imagined he could get one over on Poseidon is a complete mystery, but again, it was a mistake of epic proportions. As punishment, Poseidon had Aphrodite, the goddess of love, cause Pasiphae to fall in love with a bull, the Cretan bull, as it's very creatively called. And from the ensuing, presumably very awkward night of passion, our human-animal hybrid, the Minotaur, came into the world. So the labyrinth was Minos' solution to the problem of having a Minotaur effectively for an adopted son, or rather to not adopt the Minotaur. And he had his best craftsman, a man by the name of Daedalus, build the labyrinth in order to keep the Minotaur under lock and key. Now here's where it gets interesting. Hopefully it was interesting up to this point, but it gets more interesting here. Due to some disputes between Crete and Athens, in which Crete eventually emerged the victor, every 7 years, 7 Athenian boys and 7 Athenian girls would be sent into the labyrinth to be devoured by the Minotaur. Hopefully, just devoured. And for 20 odd years, this is the way it went, until it came time for the third round of sacrifices, when an Athenian named Theseus came along and volunteered to take the place of one of the chosen boys. Enter the hero of our story. So, stripped of all his weapons, Theseus is duly sent off to Crete to die a horrific death, and of course no sooner is he off the boat than it's love at first sight between him and the king's daughter, Ariadne. And this is the part that everyone seems to know. To survive the labyrinth and find his way out, she gives him a ball of string, which he was to unravel as he went and then follow back to the entrance. So, despite having been searched and stripped of all his weapons, Theseus still somehow manages to smuggle, in ways I really don't want to think about, both the ball and string and a bloody great big sword into the labyrinth. He makes his way to the Minotaur, and in due course overpowers and kills it, and then follows the string and finds his way out. And actually things then don't go very well for him. He doesn't get the girl, and his father ends up committing suicide after he mistakenly comes to believe that Theseus perished. It's kind of a downer. But moving back, the point is this. Taking again the film Labyrinth as an example, and if you haven't seen it, you should, it's awesome. There's a lot more going on there in terms of the mythology involved. We see a real mix of creatures and ideas, goblins and time distortion and a whole city in the centre of the labyrinth and David Bowie in tights. It's much more elaborate and varied in its choice of mythical bits and pieces from many cultures and periods. With our episode, on the other hand, everything is stripped down back to the basics, and is thus much more in line with the original story of the labyrinth, not in terms of the plot, per se, but in terms of the starkness of the challenges that both Theseus and the ponies face. It's more straightforward. Go in, encounter Beast, try to defeat Beast. Now, of course, the ponies went into the labyrinth looking for the elements of harmony, but nevertheless, it's a hybrid beast, Discord, the Draconicus, that they encounter. So just as the show's Pegasi are positioned directly to follow in the hoof steps of the original Pegasus, so too does our labyrinth descend very clearly from its original. And thematically, just as kindness resonated in both the original story of Androcles and its reference in the pilot episode, so here too does bravery in the face of the unknown, as well as a number of other themes, resonate in both the story of Theseus and in the Return of Harmony. I do hope you buy that. I want to talk about one more story before we come again to that central question of why this is important. And this final story dovetails very nicely with the story of the labyrinth. It's the story, next slide, of Icarus. And as with the other two stories, everyone kind of knows it, but it's worth recapping. We begin again with the Cretan labyrinth, and the man King Minos hired to build it, Daedalus, the most ingenious craftsman available. Now, either because when you build a supposedly inescapable prison, you really don't want anyone around who knows its ins and outs, let the information spread, or alternatively, pardon me, because Daedalus also manufactured the wooden cow that allowed Pasiphae to become pregnant by the Cretan bull and produce the Minotaur in the first place. And if I were Minos, I would not be too pleased with Daedalus. Whatever the reason, as soon as construction was done, King Minos imprisoned Daedalus and his son Icarus in a very tall tower. They couldn't escape by sea, because Minos controlled all the ocean-going vessels, and they couldn't escape by land either. So Daedalus decided that this situation, as so many situations do, called for artificial wings. Soon enough, he's tied feathers and branches together and secured them all with wax, and lo and behold, he's able to fly. He subsequently teaches Icarus how to fly as well, and they prepare their escape. And here we see an artist's depiction of Icarus with his artificial wings, just as Rarity gets hers in the episode Sonic Rainboom. Unfortunately, both Rarity and Icarus share a similar failing: excessive pride. Daedalus warns his son not to fly too low, lest the feathers get wet, or more importantly, too high, lest the wax holding them together melt. Twilight likewise warned Rarity of the delicacy of her magical wings, and to be careful with them. They were warned, but, both having ideas well above their station, literally and figuratively, and both swept up in the prospect of touching the face of God, as it were, they both flew too high, and the results were eminently predictable. They fall from grace, literally and figuratively. Falling from grace due to hubris is a common theme. Remember Bellerophon from earlier, who also dared to fly too high, albeit by other methods. It's a character flaw that rarely goes unpunished. Thankfully for Rarity, and unlike poor Icarus, who we see on the left falling past the Cretan labyrinth and the tower, thankfully for Rarity, she's saved from her fall by who else but a Pegasus. A Pegasus preventing rather than directly causing a fall. Once again, mythological references within mythological references. In all three of these examples, we see the shared thematic elements between the classical source and the way things play out in the episode. The importance of kindness, the importance of courage in the face of the unknown, the dangers of hubris, and we see these themes set up and executed with the same devices. So we come back to this central question. Why? Why does this matter? Certainly, if you're geared like me, you find these parallels and references absolutely enthralling as a matter of course. But there is actually greater relevance to the fact that these allusions are interwoven into the show. And it really begins with this. Translatio studii et imperii. I had to get some Latin in there somewhere. Have you met me? I like the Latin. This translates roughly to the Again, I'm going to try that sentence one more time. This translates roughly to the transfer of knowledge and power, specifically referring to the transfer of knowledge and power from ancient Greece and Rome to someone or something else. Bear with me on this, because it's a bit abstract. A related and much friendlier way to approach this notion is the phrase quidquid Latine dictum sit altum sonator, or whatever is said in Latin sounds profound, which it does, thank you very much. Both of these are getting at the same root idea, which is that forging a connection, forging both in the sense of building and in the sense of bullshitting in many cases, forging a connection with the ancient world, the world of classical antiquity of Greece and Rome, confers a very important and desirable kind of legitimacy. Oftentimes, this takes the form of political legitimacy and a model of militaristic power, a way to try to establish a society as the inheritors, the rightful inheritors, of the might and glory of Greece and Rome. It's been very common with a number of cultures and societies over the centuries, and I'm going to give just three quick examples. On the left we have Aeneas, whose lineage and importance in the eventual founding of Rome, Virgil, in the Aeneid, ties to Troy. Before this idea was even given its fancy Latin phrase, the Romans were, in some respects, trying to make themselves look better by connecting themselves with the Greeks. I'll get into that a little bit later. And Virgil here was also, in some sense, using this to construct propaganda, a real founding myth that would make Rome and its first emperor appear all the more impressive. In the centre, we have King Arthur, similarly tied back to the founding of Rome and Aeneas's bloodline in Geoffrey of Monmouth's pseudo-historical Historia Regum Britanniae, the history of the kings of Britain. And on the far right we have Charlemagne, similarly tied back to Rome in the Song of Roland, Le Chanson de Roland, I don't speak French, and also in other sources too. Or we can take a more modern and familiar example, if you like. Now I want to be very clear, this isn't at all a knock against America. I love America, I live here. It's a neutral observation, and it's certainly not just mine. And obviously no one is about to claim that the founders of America were somehow blood descendants of mighty Rome or Greece. That would be silly. But you need look no farther than Washington DC to see attempts, conscious or not, to capture some of the spirit of those civilizations and assume that sense of grandeur and power. The Founding Fathers penned the Federalist Papers under the pseudonym Publius because they admired the statesmanship of past eras. Another capital is filled with senators, and the political system is built on principles of democracy pioneered by the Romans and the Greeks. There is a Cato Institute, a very conservative think tank that is named for a fairly conservative Roman senator named Cato. There were two of them, in fact, Cato the Elder and Cato the Younger. Everywhere in sight are all those sodding columns. Just no. You see my point, I hope. So let's bring this back to PONIES. Much better. The key idea here, as it applies to PONIES, is that the principle of translatio studii et imperii isn't just about the transfer of political or militaristic power or influence or legitimacy. It's also about a transfer of cultural prestige, which has a power all its own. A sense of true legitimacy is just as much conferred by being able to establish connections with the great works of art and literature of the ancient world as it is with connecting with their politics or their warmongering. Now, as I said, the Romans knew this early on. They envied the Greeks, their works of philosophy and science and literature and art, even as they outwardly professed their general superiority. The humanists, who helped make the Renaissance as transformative in history as it was, were absolutely obsessed with rediscovering the knowledge and the arts of the classical period. They also knew instinctively its great value, and they consciously modelled their own works on and drew from those sources. This is a technique very well known for its effectiveness. It's not a new phenomenon. But who, I ask you, would have expected it here from that, of all places? Now, I obviously can't speak to how many of the connections with antiquity in this show were conscious and deliberate choices on the part of the writers and the artists and so forth. In all honesty, I really don't imagine they were considering it that closely. They're likely not as big eggheads as I am. But whatever their motivations, the end result is that the show's acknowledgement of these sources does in fact lend it a certain greater sophistication. But there is far more to it than that. In making these connections, the show isn't just passively referencing these earlier texts to try to make itself look better and to delight a few classics enthusiasts. And that's a useful side effect. It's not just doing it either to shoulder its way into the great Western storytelling tradition, although it does help carve out its own little niche there. It's not just rehashing that classical imagery and mythology. Instead, it is in a sense actively reinventing them. As we've seen, the original Pegasus could only carry Zeus's lightning bolts, and for all his greatness, in the end he became little more than a pack horse. Dash would not approve, and our Pegasi can not only control all the weather, but they have individual agency over the decisions they make regarding the weather, and over all their lives, and they are trusted with this power. We have the imagery of Celestia's guards using presumably ceremonial armour modelled from that of a period in equestrian history more rife with conflict. We have a female Pegasus taking on a half-breed lion. We see mares enter a labyrinth and encounter a half-breed beast, but fail the test, figuratively and literally losing their way and their identities. We have an ICARUS saved, but also redeemed in the form of rarity. We have a brand new beast, the Draconicus, that is a combination of a horse and a dragon. That's what the name means. Yet another half-breed. So the fact that friendship is magic is not only building on these myths, but also expanding on them and modifying them and adding to them and subverting them in some cases is, at least in my view, not at all destructive or disrespectful to the source material. It's actually very much a positive thing for several reasons. For one thing, it preserves the essence and some of the particulars of those original stories. It helps keep them relevant and preserve them for future generations. It's something pretentious asses like me might be less good at were we to zealously adhere to strict retellings of the stories, but far more importantly, it places the show in a kind of conversation, if you will, with these earlier texts, and it invites us as an audience to take an active rather than a passive approach, and ask questions about the significance of these differences and changes. What does it mean to us that there are hints that some form of militarism is still present in equestrian society? What does that reflect about our own culture? What does it mean that the PEGASI of this mythology were initially more powerful than the other two species, just as, races, species, just as they're far more predominant in classical mythology? What does it mean that they're now on more equal footing? What are the implications for issues of race or class or gender or so forth? These are the sorts of questions this enables us to ask. And thankfully, they are well outside the scope of this presentation, and I highly doubt I could do them justice anyway. But if you have to take anything away from this presentation, if you do take anything away from this presentation, and this is the point when I get up on my soapbox, if you take anything away from this at all, I would very much love for it to be this. It's good to think about these things. It's permissible to talk about these things. Now, I don't want anyone to misunderstand me. Do not get me wrong here. I very much appreciate that this is a show about magical candy-coloured ponies. It's important to keep all of this in its proper perspective. We are not dealing with Homer or Virgil or Milton or Shakespeare. Ponies are not serious business, and they by no means have to be treated as such. It's perfectly reasonable, and I'll allow probably more sensible, to enjoy the show purely as entertainment. It is very entertaining, it's charming, it's heartwarming, it's fun. That's why we started watching it in the first place. This fact is not lost on me, and I've approached this presentation with, trying to approach it with a good sense of humour and an awareness of just how silly the whole prospect is. But silly is not a bad thing, I would argue. And more importantly, the best entertainment, the best fiction, regardless of what genre it represents or what it has in mind as a target audience, the best fiction is that which operates on multiple levels, where when you come to it with an analytical eye and an open mind, and gently peel back each successive layer of technique and meaning, you don't come to a sudden abrupt end and find disappointingly that really there's nothing of substance underneath, but where instead you find more depth to explore, more questions to ask, more things to uncover, and in doing so you not only learn more about the construction of that piece of fiction, whether it's television or film or literature or poetry or music or any other form, and in doing so better come to appreciate the complexity and the artistry that's involved in producing it. But ideally, you also learn much more about the kind of things that you yourself value in art and in stories. And that's something that's very important to reflect on. That, in a nutshell, is why stories matter. And that's why it's especially good that here we have a show that gives a very young audience, in fact, the opportunity to become familiar with that instinctive behaviour, even as the show also, as it's meant to, educates and conveys its moral lessons. And how it conveys its moral lessons is a whole other presentation. But this is a good thing. That's all there is to it. I mean, it is a good thing. That is what I think. It is lofty stuff, I know, and I shall get down off my soapbox now. But much like this community, you can get as much from this show as you're willing to put into it. Artists and writers and musicians and many other creative types have drawn amazing inspiration from it. Part of the wonderful thing about this community, part of the thing I love about this community, is just how much creativity runs in it. And this too is an area where we can be actively engaged and thus draw out even more benefit from this show that we all love. And that is the end. All of this from a show about magical candy-coloured ponies. Who would have thought that? But that concludes this presentation. This is the part where, if I were giving it live, you could fling things at me if you wanted. But my technical issues having deprived you, sadly, of that opportunity, you're going to have to send me your questions or comments or corrections, or I really hope not hate mail, but do as you must. You can send it to me via email. That is my email address. You can also contact me via my preferred method, which is Twitter, and that's me on Twitter. You can also visit BroNYScholars.com, which is where I hope to post more of this pseudo-academic nonsense, if people are genuinely interested. Speaking of Twitter, I'd be remiss, while I still have your attention, not to give shout-outs to the Twitter bronies and the Twitter ponies. They're uniformly awesome folk, and I'm very grateful for their support in this project. So thank you to them, and if you are a brony or a Pegasister or a pony fan or whatever you like to call yourself, and you're not on Twitter, this is my shameless plug, you should really think about getting on Twitter. We're a very friendly bunch, and it's a great deal of fun, which is really what's most important. And shout-out-wise, I also need to give props to all the BroNYCon staff and the fine folks from Everfree Radio and Bronyville, who all did their very best to try to have this panel go off without a hitch at the con. Sadly, that was not to be, but I rather hope that everything turned out all right in the end. We're going to skip this slide because you can find all the blurbage I was going to bore you with in the description of this video, and I do hope you forgive all the bits where I stumbled in this. I wanted to do it all in one take, so forgive me. That is the end. One final point. Keterum, Kinseo, Carthaginem, Essay de London. Kilo Delta and Anananatri on Twitter. That one is for you. Thank you, everyone. Be excellent to each other.